This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the best way to make an amazing website. Now that I've had some quality time with the new Sony FX6, I'm gonna go ahead and review it. I'm gonna try to keep this at about 10 minutes. You guys will see the final runtime, and I'm gonna sum up everything I love about this camera and also the downsides about it, and with that, why I went ahead and canceled my pre-order. I'm gonna leave the body and the ergonomics towards the end of the video, and I wanna start out with what I absolutely love. And with that, I'm also making a video comparing the FX6 to my Sony a7S IIIs in terms of color, low light, autofocus, ergonomics, and more. So if you want to see that, go ahead and click that subscribe button and enable those notifications. Usually I would start with the design and the ergonomics, but I'll leave that towards the end. Let's start out with startup time, and this thing starts up much quicker than the FS5 Mark II, at least from what I remember. And the next thing I want to touch on is the colors. Now, one thing my Sonys don't have is that new Semitone profile that the FX6 has and Venice has. And man, I love the look of this. I pretty much shot majority in this profile. I did shoot some S-Log, and I just love the footage. If my exposure is correct, my white balance correct, I don't have to touch anything at all. It is so filmic, it is pleasant, I love the tones, and I really wish we can get that in the other Sonys, but of course that's how they're separating the FX6 and the FX9 from those other cameras. So if you're somebody that wants to run and gun, you want to go shoot, you want to turn over video quickly, but also have an amazing look that you don't have to grade, that is one of my favorite things about this camera. My second favorite thing, and the reason why I really want to own one of these cameras, is the variable electronic ND. It works so well, it is so convenient. You can dial in the exact amount of ND that you want without any issues with screw-on variable NDs. You can set it to auto mode and have it automatically adjust your exposure, and you could just dial in your aperture and the shutter speed that you want. I really wish that they would put these into the mirrorless cameras, but if they did that, we would have some downsides that come along with it, which we'll talk about in just a bit. Now let's talk about a couple other positives before we get to negatives. I also want to mention the lens that is on here. This is the new 16-35 that you can have manual focus, you can have autofocus, you can have power zoom. It's an awesome lens. It is massive and it weighs a ton. And because of that, and because of the range, I didn't use it that much. I mostly shot with the 24-105 f4. But if you're looking for a lens like this, it is an amazing option. Now, the other positive I want to talk about is low light performance. Just like the a7S III, it looks great. To me, it actually looks a bit cleaner at the lower ISOs than the a7S III, but we'll talk about that in the comparison. The footage looked fantastic. Of course, if we get into the higher ISOs, before we hit that second dual native ISO, or before you switch it over, it does get a little noisy, and the grain that you see is larger than I'm used to, because I've been shooting with the cameras that have larger sensors, and it's 6K oversampled to 4K, so you will notice that, but it also looks good. It doesn't look really smeary like you get with the other cameras, so I really had no issue. In some of the shots, I was really pleasantly surprised by how it looked, and that's thanks to the codecs, of course, and now we have that full frame sensor, which is really, really nice. Now, before I get into the biggest reasons why I canceled my pre-order, let me give a shout out to the sponsor of this video, Squarespace. If you've been thinking about making your own website, Squarespace is literally the best way to go. We've built multiple websites, and you can too, with literally no web making experience. You just choose a template, customize blocks of text and images, and easily move them around. It's incredibly simple, it's affordable, and ours have been running flawlessly for years now, bringing in new clients thanks to its built-in SEO tools. So whether you're making a website for a small business or literally anything else, go to squarespace.com/maxyuryev to start a free trial with no credit card required, or you can use the custom link down below. And when you're ready to launch, you will save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. And now let's go ahead and talk about autofocus. I do want to preface this by saying, with the autofocus and pretty much everything else I'm going to complain about, the FX6 is so much better than the FS5 Mark II. Even at the point when that came out in that time, it's on a whole nother level. So if you're happy with one of those cameras, or you have an FS7 and you want to upgrade or downgrade to a smaller body but better features, you're going to be extremely happy with this camera if you are happy with those. Now let's get into my experience. I've been using Sony cameras and other cameras for a while that have good autofocus, and I was expecting this to work just like the A7S III, and not even just to work, but at least to perform like it. It has the same sensor, has the same dual processors, but I found the autofocus would just lag behind at times. It wasn't as consistent, and even certain cases where it saw the face, it would just kind of miss, and that because of that, I wasn't as, I guess, trusting with the system. The A7S III with the same autofocus is just a lot more reliable. In the wide mode, it chooses what I want to be in focus 99% of the time without me having to tell it, which is great. The FX6 is probably 85, maybe 90% of the time, and that's enough for me to use it, but I still feel a little bit uneasy in certain cases. And in some shots, I would just switch to manual because I knew I wanted to make sure I had it in focus where I wouldn't have to do it with a couple other cameras. Now, who knows? Maybe Sony will fix this with software because it does seem to be like a software thing. Now, I love that you could select face-only autofocus, which we don't get in other cameras unless it's like a cinema line camera, which that part is really great for interviews. And the other thing that really just frustrated me is the touchscreen setup. You can't just simply touch and have it focus on where you want. You have to enable it in the menu first and then go ahead and touch, and then that goes away, which is frustrating, and you touch it and it's not focusing. And then with that, you don't get the tracking autofocus, which is so nice with Canon cameras, with Sony mirrorless cameras. That I just got used to using that, and it is such a great feature for gimbal work, for just anything, and you don't get that, and it really doesn't make sense, and it really makes the autofocus a lot less usable in this camera. And now let's talk about stabilization. Of course, we do not have IBIS built into the sensor. Some people keep asking for it, other people don't want it. I talked to some camera manufacturers, not Sony, and I was told that it's probably not gonna happen because when you have a sensor moving around with ND filters in there, you're gonna have issues. So it's either the ND or the IBIS. So you guys kind of get to choose. Now, of course, we do have the stabilization in Catalyst Browse, which is quite nice. You can't do that for 4K 120, which sucks, and the app crashed on me quite a bit. So I personally would love to have some digital stabilization built in that would bake into the file. If that would be possible, that would be amazing. I really like the IBIS with the active stabilization on the A7S III. It works really well, especially for unstabilized lenses. But that's the stabilization part. I guess with the larger body and the ergonomics, which feel great, you do get a little bit more stabilization compared to a mirrorless camera, but that is a downside. Another downside is audio, and this is probably what makes the least sense to me. We have two XLR jacks here built into the handle, which also has a nice mic up top, the multi-digital interface, so you can connect lav mics, other mics without having to have a cable. That is nice. A lot of controls here on the grip, but we don't have an XLR on the body itself, which I would be okay with. I would understand for times where you're using a gimbal or you want to be really small, not having that. But it really doesn't make sense that we don't have a 3.5mm jack. I love that about the C200. I can throw it on a gimbal, put a little wireless pack on there, and get great audio. Now, we do have a scratch mic built in here, but it doesn't sound good. It's right here on the side. And I don't know, I wish they did something. Like we have this headphone jack, if it could do both, like you can on, say, laptops and a lot of other devices, that would solve that issue. I don't know if that's possible with the firmware update, probably not. But I don't know why they didn't think of that or ask people about that. So you have to use the handle if you want to get good audio. And while we're talking about usability, let's quickly talk about the design. Very similar to the FS5 Mark II. There are some improvements. The grip's been slightly changed. I do still wish we had a second scroll dial. That would be really nice. And I wish that we can map your ISO to that so you can just adjust quickly instead of using the little levers over here. They have to preset it and it's cumbersome. It's a lot slower in that way. Now, it is nice to have a ton of different buttons that you can customize. I can pretty much find most things that I want fairly quickly. But overall, as far as the usability and the speed of use, including the menus, which have been improved, it is just slower than using a mirrorless camera. I really wish we can have the menu from the A7S III on this camera. It would make things better, and the ability to map your ISO over here and other things. It's an improvement, but I wish the two teams would kind of work together and use the best of what's new. which they didn't. Now the LCD is quite good. I didn't have problems judging focus with it, and it's quite bright. It's a touch screen, so there is a new little pop-up menu where you can change some things. It's better than nothing, but still not as good as I would hope for. But no actual complaints on the screen itself. I do have a complaint that we don't have an EVF anymore. I thought it was fine during the announcement, but once I started shooting with it, there were times where I just wish I had the EVF. And of course we didn't. It does make the camera smaller and lighter, which is good. It's smaller than the FS5 Mark II. But instead you've got to attach something onto here. It's not as nice as having the EVF. Another thing that's not as nice are the codecs. Now this basically has the same sensor, same processors. You can shoot 4K 120, but there's a lot of weird limitations because they're using an older codec with the MXF wrapper, and because of that you can't shoot 4K 120 with audio using the regular modes. It's limited to 4K 60, and if you want 4K 120, which is crazy still, it blows my mind, you have to use the S&Q mode, which means it automatically slows it down, which also means there's no audio and other limitations, and that is really a bummer for me. Now along with that, you can't shoot HEVC, which is more efficient. There's one mode for 10-bit. You just get a lot more limitations, and I know they wanted to use the cinema type codec, but it's older, it's less advanced. I just wish that now that we've experienced having a ton of great options in the other cameras, that they would put it in this one. And with that, if you want to shoot DCI, you can't get 4K 120. That's because of a processor issue, because it has to crop in, and then it no longer would be DCI. So that's a limitation. And then also, if you shoot 4K 24, true 24, you don't get autofocus. At least that's what I've heard. I didn't experience that. I was shooting 3840 all the time, the UHD spec, but that also is something that just kind of doesn't make sense. Now, as far as battery life, it is quite good if you consider that we have this massive heat sink, we have a fan in here, it has to cool down everything, and it never overheats. There's a lot more power draw going on here, and I got about 2.5 hours shooting 4K, and for 4K 120, about an hour 15 to about an hour and a half. It's very similar to the A7S III, but of course this battery is much larger in order to be able to do that. Now this is the U35 battery. They do have larger ones, and it fits nicely in the slot. So if you need better battery life, of course, you can use a bigger battery. And now let's talk about the prices. This thing is $6,000, and I have to say, if you're looking for a camera like this, that is a steal. It is $700 less than the FS5 when that came out, and of course you have to also account for inflation, how much prices have went up. So they chose a great price for this camera, and if you're looking for a camera like this, I think you'll be extremely happy. Some people will actually downgrade from the FX9 to this, I believe, because you have 4K 120, you have 4K 60 with no crop, the low light performance is great, the autofocus is better, there's just so much improvements over that camera. So why did I cancel my pre-order with this camera? Well, after using it, seeing how similar it is to the A7S III, it does have some upsides, but also some downsides, and looking over my needs and what I truly need, I felt like dealing with the extra size and weight and the limitations that comes with this camera isn't really worth the upsides, even though some of them I would really like, and a lot of it I could do and do better with the A7S III. And in reality, I just would rather get another one of these, not even thinking about price. Forget about the price difference, just camera to camera. So of course I will have a more detailed comparison showing you guys footage and differences between these two. If you guys want to see that, click that little notification bell down below. Let me know your thoughts. If you have any other questions, I would be happy to answer them down in the comments section. And once again, shout out to Squarespace for sponsoring this channel for many years now. They have a great service. Try out their trial. There's no credit card needed. Thank you guys for watching. This has been Max, and I'll see you in the next video.